Minister, I would like to call upon a member of the opposition to answer these remarks.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Speaker. The way I'm going to address my speech is simply this. I'm going to talk about the idea of the evolution of democracy and how sometimes the evolution of democracies had a little push around the world. That's why it's working. Then I want to talk about this idea of stability and consistency and their beautiful trickle-down Reaganomic idea of how they're going to solve the world's problems. But then I want to go back into a substantive new line of argumentation that's been sort of touched on by this side of the House. They mentioned it, and that's the whole idea of morality. And I wish to spend a substantial part of my latter part of my speech dealing with what I think something's been missed here, which is the idea of morality and how morality should be involved in all our decisions, and how morality should never be ignored on any of our decisions, especially those which have so much effect as world trade. What was the first thing we heard from this side of the House, the second speaker? We have something called the evolution of democracy. Look at China. It seems to be a very popular example so far in this House today. Look at China. I mean, look how much progress has been made with China. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Speaker, a few years ago the United States said, if you don't improve, we're going to remove the very beneficial trade idea of first world nation status, most favored nation status. We believe these types of pressures, which are not just put on by the United States, the rest of the world is also, no thank you sir, is also pushing for these types of internal and pressures to get China to change. And guess what? China's changing. You may say that there's an evolution of democracy, but this evolution is not natural. This evolution comes through hard work and the work of the rest of the world to guide them toward this evolution. And this is what this side of the House is saying. This side of the House says simply this. Democracy will evolve if it's given a push, if it's given a helping hand. And that's exactly what trade sanctions do. That's exactly what trade sanctions have done in China. And that's exact benefits that China has accrued. On that point, sir.
If linking MFN status to human rights was so successful, why did Bill Clinton reverse it?
What I'm talking about is the fact that he applied that pressure. I mean, and I'll go into this idea of consistency, which they seem to be throwing about in this House today, and I think that it's a completely erroneous line of argumentation. Apparently, for foreign policy to be adequate and appropriate, must be applied equally, exactly the same, to every single nation in the world. That is completely ridiculous. Mr. Speaker, no thank you. Mr. Speaker, is it appropriate to say that we're going to affect what we believe is appropriate in Cuba, which the United States seems to believe is a unilateral and absolute trade embargo? They feel that is appropriate to help evolve into a system of democracy. Is it appropriate in South Africa to say we need to have trade sanctions in South Africa around the world? Is that appropriate? Is it consistent? Is in China the idea that we must improve the human rights of their nations? What is the best way to do it? We're going to do it through gentle pushes and encouragements. Are these things inconsistent? No. The consistency is we're here to improve the lot of all the people in the world, not the method by which you accomplish that goal. It's the goal itself which is consistent, sir, not the methods. And to say that you have to have consistent methods throughout the world, it's absolutely ridiculous. You have to have consistent goals, not methods, sir. No, thank you. What was the next thing they talked about? Was this idea that trade leads to stability. They said it enough times, it almost seems realistic, doesn't it? Trade stability, trade stability. It seems to work for Western democracies. It must work everywhere else in the world. I'd like to point out a country called Iraq. They had lots of trade before the Gulf War. In fact, they had more trade than anybody else in the world. They had billions of dollars worth of oil, which they traded freely. I mean, that didn't lead to stability in the country, did it? It led to war. How can they say that trade equals stability? I'm sorry, it doesn't. What equals stability is encouragement. What leads to stability is the idea that if people don't change their ways, they lose the stability that they've had. The idea that the trade is a weapon, but it's a useless weapon if it's never used. If we had said, no thank you, sir, if we had said to Iraq before the Gulf War, listen, if you continue to do this, if you continue to act this way, you're going to lose the ability to trade oil. If you continue to do these things, you're going to lose those abilities. Would it have affected their actions? It probably would. The reason why Iraq did it is because they thought nobody else in the world cared enough about Kuwait.
On that point, sir.
That's why there was no action. If there'd been an uproar, no thank you, sir, if there'd been an uproar and a prevention of the idea that they were going that Iraq would have lost something, would have lost this trade, then they would have actually acted. But there was no international effort. The international effort came late. So yes, we believe that trade can lead to stability, but only if this trade is encouraging the countries to move in the right direction and actually is encouraging stability. That's why trade equals stability only if trade encourages stability.
Sir.
On that point, sir.
Yes, sir. Concerning your Iraq example, isn't it the case that the United States wanted to help Iraq at that point because they were at war with Iran, an arch enemy of the United States, and that this is favoritism and it is inconsistent with the moral case that you are about to put forward?
No, sir. Clearly that is not what we are saying. When I talk about the ideas of consistency, I'm talking about the consistency of goals, not the consistency of methods. And the consistency of goals in the entire region was to get something to happen. And I believe that is the consistency that we need in the world, is the consistency of goals, not the consistency of methods.
On that point,
What's
sir.
the next thing? No, thank you, sir. What's the next thing they talked about? This idea of trickle-down. Trickle-down economics seems to work. If you allow the company to get rich, then all the poor people who are starving and have their human rights violated are suddenly going to have their human rights violated, but now have BMWs, apparently, what they're saying. No, clearly what we're talking about is, in another example, once again, if I use Iraq, no, thank you. In Iraq, before the Gulf War, were the average citizens, even with multitude of trade, were the average citizens any better off? Were their human rights any better protected? Clearly, they were not. If the United States had traded with Cuba for the last 30, 40 years, if this had happened, then would there be free press in Cuba? Would there be human rights espoused in Cuba? No, there wouldn't be. We believe there'd still be a strong communist dictatorship there, and it would accomplish nothing. The last thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of morality. It was addressed first on this side of the House, and I think it needs to be addressed here today. I'm sorry, but it's so simple to say we shouldn't do anything but trade with these people because it's good for everybody. It may be good for us. It may be good because we've got all this money from it. Yeah, we make money from trade, no kidding. And it hurts us not to trade. But we're saying on this side of the House that morality must come into play with every decision we make. Every decision we make, and especially trade, because it has such a huge impact on the world. If we're looking at a third world country, we have to make a decision. How do we best affect change? How do the best we affect our morality? How do we best affect the morality of human rights are a good thing? How do we best affect this around the world? We have a moral obligation and a moral duty, and you're out of order, sir. We have a moral obligation and a moral duty to do everything we can to affect change around the world. And we believe on this side of the House that every decision we make, and especially trade, must be balanced with our morality and the morality of the goals of democracy, the morality of the goals of freedom of speech, morality of the goals of human rights. This is the morality we stand on. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we beg to oppose.